The stagecoach wheels kicked up clouds of red dust as they rolled towards Cedar Ridge, Texas. Inside, Catherine Running-Wolf pressed her face against the grimy window, watching the endless prairie stretch toward the horizon. Her reflection stared. Back-high cheekbones, bronze skin, and dark eyes that betrayed her Comanche heritage, despite the carefully arranged blonde curls and modest blue dress she wore dotting her trembling hands. She clutched a worn letter from Samuel Morrison, a prosperous merchant who had promised her a new life far from the reservation where dreams went to die. What Samuel didn't know, what she hadn't dared to write in her carefully worded responses, was that Catherine Running-Wolf was about to shatter every assumption he'd made about his perfect Eastern bride. The year was 1885, and America was still bleeding from the wounds of its expansion westward. For a woman of mixed blood caught between two worlds, finding acceptance anywhere seemed impossible. But sometimes, the most broken people create the strongest bonds, and sometimes, the greatest love stories begin with the greatest deceptions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop outside Peterson's General Store, throwing Catherine against the worn leather seat. Through the dust-covered window, she could see Cedar Ridge in all its frontier glory, a collection of weathered wooden buildings lined up along a single dirt road like soldiers preparing for battle. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the tin roofs, creating shimmering heat waves that made the entire town appear to dance. Catherine smoothed her blue cotton dress and checked her reflection in the small mirror she kept hidden in her reticule. The blonde wig she wore purchased with the last of her savings from a traveling merchant in San Antonio was perfectly arranged despite the jarring ride. Her naturally bronze skin had been lightened with rice powder, and careful application of rouge had changed the shape of her features just enough to pass casual inspection. For 6 months, she had corresponded with Samuel Morrison under the name Catherine Wells, claiming to be the orphan daughter of a Philadelphia minister. The deception had been born of desperation, but she had maintained it with the skill of someone who understood that survival sometimes required becoming someone else entirely. "End of the line, miss," called the driver, a grizzled man whose face bore the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades staring into the Texas sun. Cedar Ridge, population 400 and growing, according to the town council. Catherine gathered her small carpetbag, the only possession that had survived her journey from the Comanche reservation to this moment of reckoning. Inside were her mother's beaded bracelet, her father's military discharge papers, and 3 carefully pressed dresses that represented every penny she had managed to save during her years as a seamstress in San Antonio. The driver helped her down from the stage, his calloused hands respectful but brief in their contact. Around them, the activity of a growing frontier town continued with practiced efficiency. Cowboys loaded supplies onto wagons while their horses stamped impatiently in the heat. Women in sunbonnets moved between the buildings with purposeful steps, their long skirts sweeping the dust as they went about their daily business. But Catherine noticed something else in their movements, a wariness. Away their eyes swept the horizon constantly, as if expecting trouble. This was still wild country, where the memory of Indian raids remained fresh and fear shaped daily decisions. "You the lady here to meet Samuel Morrison?" asked a voice behind her. Catherine turned to see a woman approaching, perhaps 40 years old, with graying brown hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of Catherine's appearance. Her dress was well made but practical, and she carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I am Catherine Wells," Catherine replied, grateful that months of practice had made the false name feel natural on her tongue. "Mr. Morrison was expecting me on today's stage." The woman's expression grew troubled, and Catherine felt her carefully constructed world begin to shift beneath her feet. "I'm Margaret Fuller, president of the Cedar Ridge Ladies Auxiliary, the woman said. I'm afraid I have some difficult news about Mr. Morrison. Catherine's heart began to race, but she forced her expression to remain calm. Years of hiding her true nature had taught her to control her reactions, even when panic threatened to overwhelm her. What kind of news? She asked quietly. Margaret Fuller glanced around as if ensuring they wouldn't be overheard, then moved closer. Samuel Morrison died 3 days ago. Heart attack, the doctor said. Dropped dead right in the middle of his store while serving customers. The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. Samuel Morrison, her lifeline, her chance at a respectable life, her escape from the poverty and prejudice that had defined her existence, was dead. The future she had pinned all her hopes on had vanished in an instant. I see, Catherine managed, though her mind was reeling. Without Samuel, she had no place in Cedar Ridge, no money to return to San Antonio, and no plan for survival. The funeral was yesterday, Margaret continued, her voice carrying a note of genuine sympathy. The whole town attended. Samuel was well respected here. Been in business for over 10 years. Built that store up from nothing. Catherine looked toward the general store that bore Morrison's name in faded paint across its front window. Through the glass, she could see shelves lined with goods and a younger man, perhaps Samuel's business partner, serving customers. Did he ever mention me? Catherine asked, though she dreaded the answer. Margaret's expression grew even more uncomfortable. That's the other part of the difficult news, dear. Samuel did mention expecting a bride, but... She paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase her next words delicately. But what? Well, he described you quite differently than how you appear. Said you were a minister's daughter from Philadelphia, fair-skinned with light eyes. He seemed to expect someone more traditionally Eastern in appearance. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. Even with her disguise, her Comanche heritage was visible to anyone who looked closely. The high cheekbones, the slight olive tone to her skin that no amount of rice powder could completely hide. The way she moved with the unconscious grace of someone raised in 2 cultures. I've been traveling for weeks, Catherine said carefully. The sun has darkened my complexion considerably. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, and Catherine knew her explanation wasn't entirely convincing. But before the conversation could continue, a new voice interrupted them. Mrs. Fuller, is this the lady Samuel was expecting? Both women turned to see a tall man approaching from the direction of the store. He was perhaps 35, with sandy brown hair and intelligent hazel eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His clothes marked him as prosperous, a well-tailored vest, clean shirt, and boots that spoke of quality rather than mere function. Dr. James Mitchell, Margaret said, her tone noticeably warmer. This is Miss Catherine Wells. I was just explaining about Samuel's unfortunate passing. Dr. Mitchell removed his hat respectfully, revealing hair that caught the sunlight in unexpected highlights. Miss Wells, please accept my condolences on your loss. Samuel spoke of you often during your correspondence. He was very much looking forward to your arrival. Catherine studied the doctor's face, searching for signs of suspicion or rejection. But his expression showed only kindness and genuine concern for her circumstances. Thank you, she replied. I confess I'm uncertain what to do now. My situation has become quite complicated. I imagine it has, Dr. Mitchell said thoughtfully. You've traveled a considerable distance only to find your intended husband deceased, and yourself stranded in an unfamiliar place. The directness of his assessment was both comforting and terrifying. Catherine had spent so long crafting careful phrases and diplomatic responses that encountering someone who spoke plainly felt almost dangerous. The stage doesn't return for 3 days, Margaret added, though her tone suggested she thought Catherine's departure couldn't come soon enough. The hotel might have accommodations, though I should warn you that Cedar Ridge isn't accustomed to unaccompanied ladies staying for extended periods." The underlying message was clear. Catherine was an unwelcome complication in a town that valued order and predictability. Her presence, especially without Samuel Morrison's protection, was already causing discomfort. "Perhaps," Dr. Mitchell interjected, "we shouldn't rush to decisions. Miss Wells has just received shocking news and traveled a great distance. She deserves time to consider her options carefully." Catherine felt a flutter of gratitude toward this stranger who seemed willing to advocate for her when she had no advocate for herself. But she also sensed undercurrents in the conversation that she didn't fully understand, tensions between the doctor and Mrs. Fuller that went beyond their differing opinions about her situation. "Dr. Mitchell," Margaret said with barely concealed irritation, "while your compassion is admirable, we must consider the practical realities. Miss Wells has no family here, no means of support, and no established place in our community. Surely the kindest thing would be to help her return to her people in Philadelphia." "My people," Catherine repeated softly, the phrase carrying painful irony. Her people were scattered across reservations and government schools, their culture systematically destroyed by the same civilization that now rejected her for carrying their blood. "Are you quite certain?" Dr. Mitchell asked, studying Catherine's face with the careful attention of someone trained to notice details, "that returning to Philadelphia is what you want?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Catherine wasn't sure she understood. But something in the doctor's tone suggested he saw more than he was saying, knew more than he was revealing. "I'm not certain of anything at the moment," Catherine admitted, deciding that honesty might serve her better than continued deception. "Then perhaps," Dr. Mitchell said, "you should take some time to explore your options before making any permanent decisions. Cedar Ridge may be a small town, but it's growing. There might be opportunities here that you haven't considered." Margaret Fuller's expression grew distinctly frosty. "Dr. Mitchell, surely you're not suggesting that Miss Wells remain in Cedar Ridge indefinitely? Without proper sponsorship or employment, such an arrangement would be highly irregular." "I'm suggesting," the doctor replied calmly, "that we treat Miss Wells with the same Christian charity we would extend to any traveler in distress. Samuel Morrison invited her here in good faith. The least we can do is ensure she has time to make informed decisions about her future." Catherine watched this exchange with growing fascination. Clearly, Dr. Mitchell and Mrs. Fuller represented different factions within the town's social structure. The doctor seemed more open to unconventional solutions, while Mrs. Fuller appeared determined to maintain strict social boundaries. "Where would you suggest she stay?" Margaret asked pointedly. "The hotel is expensive and not suitable for a lady traveling alone. The boarding house is full, and private homes would be inappropriate without proper introductions." Dr. Mitchell was quiet for a moment, clearly considering the practical challenges. Then his face brightened with what appeared to be inspiration. "Actually," he said, "there might be a solution that would benefit everyone involved. My sister Ruth runs a small school for the children of local ranchers. She's been looking for someone to help with teaching and boarding arrangements. The position includes room and board, and it would give Miss Wells time to establish herself in the community." Catherine felt her heart leap with unexpected hope. Teaching was something she could do. Her years at the mission school had given her education that many frontier women lacked. But she also recognized the precarious nature of the offer. Any close scrutiny of her background would reveal the deception she had built her new identity upon. "I appreciate Dr. Mitchell's generous suggestion," she said carefully, "but I should mention that my teaching experience is limited. I wouldn't want to misrepresent my qualifications." "What experience do you have?" the doctor asked. Catherine thought quickly, trying to weave truth into her fictional background. "I assisted my father with Sunday school classes and helped teach reading to the children of his parishioners." Nothing formal, but I'm comfortable with basic education. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had indeed taught reading, though it had been to Comanche children at the mission school rather than the children of Philadelphia parishioners. That sounds perfectly adequate for our needs, Dr. Mitchell said. Ruth's school serves ranchers' children who might otherwise receive no formal education at all. Your experience would be more than sufficient. Margaret Fuller's expression suggested she had serious reservations about this entire arrangement. But social pressure prevented her from voicing outright objection to what appeared to be a charitable solution. I suppose, she said reluctantly, that such an arrangement might be acceptable on a temporary basis. But Miss Wells should understand that Cedar Ridge is a close-knit community. We value stability and conventional behavior. The warning was unmistakable, and Catherine nodded her understanding. She would be watched, evaluated, and judged by standards that left little room for error. I understand completely, Catherine replied. I have no desire to cause disruption or controversy. I simply hope to make a useful contribution while I determine my long-term plans. Dr. Mitchell smiled, the expression transforming his serious features into something surprisingly warm. Excellent. Let me take you to meet Ruth. I think you'll find her quite welcoming, and the school is a pleasant place to spend some time while you adjust to your new circumstances. As they began walking toward the edge of town, Catherine caught Mrs. Fuller's parting words to a group of women who had gathered nearby. We'll see how long this arrangement lasts, Margaret said in a voice clearly intended to be overheard. Some people simply don't belong in places like Cedar Ridge, no matter how charitable we try to be. The comment stung, but Catherine had endured worse. What concerned her more was the growing certainty that her disguise wouldn't hold up under prolonged scrutiny. Dr. Mitchell had already looked at her with the trained eye of someone accustomed to seeing beneath surfaces. How long before he or others began asking questions she couldn't answer? As they walked through the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge, Catherine found herself caught between hope and terror. The possibility of starting fresh in this frontier town was intoxicating, but the knowledge that discovery could lead to rejection or worse made every step feel like walking on a knife's edge. Tell me about yourself, Miss Wells, Dr. Mitchell said as they passed the church and headed toward a small cluster of buildings on the town's outskirts. What brings a minister's daughter from Philadelphia to the Texas frontier? The question she had been dreading had finally come, delivered. In a tone of friendly curiosity that made it impossible to deflect, Catherine took a deep breath and prepared to spin another strand of the web of deception that was becoming her new life. But as she looked into Dr. Mitchell's intelligent hazel eyes, she found herself wondering if honesty might not be the greater risk, and if the truth might not be the key to the acceptance she had spent her entire life seeking. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The schoolhouse sat on a gentle rise overlooking Cedar Ridge, a modest wooden structure painted white with green shutters that had seen better days. As Catherine and Dr. Mitchell approached, the sound of children's voices drifted through the open window's recitation, mixed with laughter that spoke of a learning environment more relaxed than the rigid mission schools Catherine remembered from her own childhood. Ruth built this place with her own savings, Dr. Mitchell explained as they climbed the front steps. She taught back east for 10 years before coming to Texas, said she wanted to make education accessible to children who might never see the inside of a traditional classroom. Through the window, Catherine could see a woman of perhaps 30 with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, moving among a dozen children of various ages. Her dress was simple but well made, and her manner suggested someone completely comfortable with her authority, yet gentle in its exercise. Miss Wells, Dr. Mitchell called through the open door. Might we interrupt for a moment? Ruth Mitchell looked up from helping a young boy with his slate, her face brightening at the sight of her brother. But Catherine noticed how the teacher's expression shifted when her gaze fell on the newcomer, not with hostility, but with the keen assessment of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. "Children," Ruth announced, "please continue with your arithmetic problems. I'll be right back." She stepped outside, wiping chalk dust from her hands on a small towel. Up close, Catherine could see that Ruth Mitchell possessed the same intelligent eyes as her brother, though hers held a wariness that suggested difficult experiences had taught her caution. "Ruth, this is Miss Catherine Wells," Dr. Mitchell began. "She was coming to Cedar Ridge to marry Samuel Morrison, but as you know—" "Oh my," Ruth interrupted, her expression immediately softening with sympathy. "You poor dear. What a terrible shock that must have been." Catherine found herself genuinely moved by the warmth in Ruth's voice. After Margaret Fuller's barely concealed hostility, encountering someone who seemed instinctively kind was almost overwhelming. "Thank you," Catherine managed. "Your brother mentioned you might have need of teaching assistance. I realize my qualifications are modest, but I'm willing to work hard and learn." Ruth studied Catherine's face with professional interest. "What's your educational background?" Catherine had prepared for this question during their walk from town. "I was educated at home by my father, who was a minister in Philadelphia. I helped him teach Sunday school and reading classes for the children in his congregation." "And your father encouraged your education beyond what most women receive?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than suspicion, but Catherine sensed deeper meaning behind it. Ruth Mitchell was clearly a woman who had fought for her own educational opportunities and recognized kindred spirits. "He believed that knowledge was a gift to be shared," Catherine replied, choosing her words carefully. "He felt that women had a particular responsibility to teach children, regardless of their circumstances." It wasn't entirely false. Running Bear, her Comanche father, had indeed believed in the power of knowledge, though his lessons had been about survival, nature, and the old ways rather than reading and arithmetic. "I like that philosophy," Ruth said with a smile that reached her eyes. "Would you be interested in seeing what we do here?" Over the next hour, Catherine found herself immersed in a teaching environment unlike anything she had expected to find. On the Texas frontier, Ruth's students ranged in age from 6 to 14, children whose families lived on isolated ranches and farms scattered across the surrounding county. They came to the school Monday through Friday, many boarding in town during the week because daily travel wasn't practical. What impressed Catherine most was Ruth's teaching method. Rather than the rote memorization she remembered from mission schools, Ruth encouraged questions, discussions, and practical applications of learning. When a 12-year-old girl asked why she needed to learn mathematics, Ruth demonstrated by calculating the cost of feeding cattle through winter. When a boy struggled with reading, she found books about horses and ranching that captured his interest. "Most of these children will return to ranching life," Ruth explained as they watched the students work. "But that doesn't mean they shouldn't have every educational opportunity we can provide. Some may choose different paths, and others will be better ranchers for understanding business, reading contracts, and managing finances." Catherine nodded, thinking of her own truncated education. She had been taken from her family at age 7 and placed in a government school designed to kill the Indian and save the man. The brutal suppression of her culture and language had left scars that still ached, but it had also given her literacy and mathematical skills that few women of any background possessed. "Miss Wells," called a voice from across the room. Catherine turned to see a girl of perhaps 10 with blonde braids and bright blue eyes. "Are you going to be our new teacher?" "I'm not sure yet, Sarah," Ruth answered before Catherine could respond. "Miss Wells and I are still discussing possibilities." But the child's question had captured the attention of the entire class, and Catherine found herself the focus of a dozen curious stares. The children's interest was innocent and direct, lacking the suspicion she had encountered from the adults. "In town. Where did you come from?" asked a boy who looked to be about 8. Pennsylvania, Catherine replied, sticking to her established story. That's really far away, the boy said with awe. Did you come on the train the whole way? Part of the way, Catherine answered truthfully. And part by stagecoach. Why did you want to come to Texas? Asked another child. Catherine felt the weight of multiple gazes, not just the children's innocent curiosity, but Ruth's professional assessment and Dr. Mitchell's thoughtful observation. How could she explain the desperate flight from poverty and prejudice that had driven her across a continent? Sometimes, she said carefully, people need to find new places where they can be useful. I heard that Texas had opportunities for women willing to work hard. It was a diplomatic answer that seemed to satisfy the children while revealing nothing dangerous about her true circumstances. But Catherine noticed that Dr. Mitchell's expression had grown more thoughtful, as if her words had triggered some deeper consideration. Children, Ruth announced, it's time for afternoon recess. Please put away your materials and go outside quietly. As the students filed out in an orderly but eager procession, Catherine found herself alone with the Mitchell siblings. The moment felt significant, though she wasn't sure why. Miss Wells, Ruth said once the children were safely outside, I have to ask you something directly, and I hope you won't take offense. Catherine's heart began to race, but she forced her expression to remain calm. Of course, your appearance and some of your mannerisms, they suggest you might have experience with people from different cultural backgrounds. Is that correct? The question was asked with careful neutrality, but Catherine sensed that her answer could determine whether she found acceptance or rejection in this place. Dr. Mitchell watched quietly, his expression unreadable. What do you mean exactly? Catherine asked, buying time to consider her response. Ruth glanced at her brother, then back at Catherine. We occasionally have students here whose families include mixed heritage, children who are part Mexican, part Indian, sometimes part Anglo. They face particular challenges in our community, and they need teachers who understand their situation. Catherine felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Ruth wasn't asking about her own background directly, but about her ability to work with children who faced the same challenges she knew all too well. I believe, Catherine said slowly, that all children deserve education and kindness, regardless of their heritage. That's a beautiful sentiment, Dr. Mitchell interjected. But Ruth is asking whether you have practical experience dealing with the prejudices such children face. The directness of his question forced Catherine to make a choice. She could continue her deception and hope for the best, or she could reveal enough truth to demonstrate her qualifications while protecting her own secret. In Philadelphia, she said carefully, my father's congregation included families from many backgrounds. I've seen how children suffer when adults judge them for circumstances beyond their control. I've also seen how education can open doors that prejudice tries to close. It wasn't a complete lie. The mission school had indeed brought together children from various tribes, and she had witnessed both the cruelty of forced assimilation and the power of literacy to navigate the white world. Ruth's eyes brightened with what appeared to be relief. That's exactly the kind of understanding we need. We have 3 students currently enrolled whose mixed heritage has made them unwelcome in some of the other educational options in the county. What kind of challenges do they face? Catherine asked, genuinely curious. Exclusion from social activities, Dr. Mitchell explained. Verbal harassment from other children whose parents have taught them prejudice. Academic expectations that are either too low or impossibly high, depending on whether people think mixed-blood children are inferior or need to prove themselves worthy of acceptance. Catherine nodded, recognizing the impossible double bind she knew intimately. Too Indian for white society, too assimilated for traditional tribal life, caught forever between worlds that each demanded complete loyalty. There's something else, Ruth added, lowering her voice. One of our students, a girl named Elena Vasquez, has been having particular difficulties. Her father is Mexican, her mother was Comanche, and she's been struggling with questions about her identity. Catherine's breath caught. A child with Comanche heritage, facing the same internal conflict that had driven Catherine to create an entirely false identity. "What kind of struggles?" she asked quietly. "She's angry," Dr. Mitchell explained. Angry at her parents for not teaching her about her mother's people. Angry at the world for making her feel ashamed of her heritage. Angry at herself for caring what others think. "Her mother died when Elena was very young," Ruth continued. "Her father loves her deeply, but he doesn't know how to help her understand the part of herself that comes from her mother's people." Catherine felt tears threaten, recognizing her own childhood pain in the description of this unknown girl. The desperate need to understand where she belonged. The shame imposed by a society that saw her heritage as something to be overcome rather than celebrated. "I'd like to meet her," Catherine said impulsively. Ruth and Dr. Mitchell exchanged a meaningful look, and Catherine realized she had revealed more about herself than she intended. Her immediate emotional response to Elena's situation had exposed the personal connection she felt to the child's struggle. "She's actually one of our boarding students," Ruth explained. "Her father's ranch is too far for daily travel, so she stays in town during the week. She'll be returning from recess soon." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of children's voices announced the end of recess. Catherine watched through the window as students began filing back into the classroom, laughing and chattering about their games. Among them was a girl who stood out not just for her obvious mixed heritage, but for the way she held herself apart from the group. She was perhaps 12, with the high cheekbones and bronze skin that marked her Comanche ancestry. But her dark hair was braided in the Anglo style, and her dress was identical to those worn by the other girls. Yet there was something in her posture, in the way she moved with unconscious grace, that spoke of the warrior heritage she carried. Catherine recognized it because she saw the same bearing in her own reflection every morning. "That's Elena," Ruth said softly. "She's brilliant, probably the brightest student I've ever taught. But she's also one of the loneliest." Catherine watched as Elena took her seat, noticed how the other children gave her space that seemed respectful, but also isolating. The girl was included, but not embraced, accepted but not welcomed. "Elena," Ruth called out as the students settled. "Would you come here for a moment? I'd like you to meet someone." The girl approached with careful dignity, her dark eyes assessing Catherine with an intelligence that seemed far beyond her years. When she spoke, her voice carried the precise diction of someone who had been taught to speak properly, but retained subtle inflections that hinted at other linguistic influences. "Good afternoon," Elena said politely. "Ruth mentioned we might have a new teacher." "This is Miss Catherine Wells," Ruth explained. "She's considering helping us here at the school." Elena's gaze fixed on Catherine's face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. The child was clearly seeing more than the carefully constructed disguise that had fooled the adults in town. "Where are you from, Miss Wells?" Elena asked. "Pennsylvania," Catherine replied, maintaining her established story. "You don't look like most people from Pennsylvania," Elena observed with the directness that only children possess. The comment hung in the air, loaded with implications that Catherine wasn't sure how to address. Ruth and Dr. Mitchell watched the exchange with obvious interest, clearly curious about how both Elena and Catherine would navigate this moment. "People come from many different backgrounds," Catherine said carefully. "Appearance doesn't always tell you everything about someone's history." Elena's eyes narrowed slightly, and Catherine realized the girl had recognized something in her that the adults had missed. There was a moment of silent communication between them, a recognition that transcended words. "That's true," Elena agreed finally. "Sometimes the most interesting people are the ones whose stories are more complicated than they first appear." The statement carried weight far beyond its simple words. And Catherine understood that Elena Vasquez had just offered her a kind of alliance. The girl knew she was looking at someone who understood the burden of carrying multiple identities. "I think," Catherine said, meeting Elena's gaze directly, "that everyone's story is more complicated than it first appears. The question is whether we're brave enough to let people see our real stories." Elena smiled for the first time since Catherine had been watching her, and the expression transformed her serious face into something radiant. "I'd like that," the girl said quietly. "I'd like to hear some real stories for a change." As Elena returned to her seat and Ruth began the afternoon lessons, Catherine realized she had just committed herself to something far more dangerous than simply hiding her identity. She had promised honesty to a child who desperately needed it, and keeping that promise might require revealing truths that could destroy the fragile, new life she was trying to build. But looking at Elena's eager face as the girl threw herself into her lessons with renewed energy, Catherine understood that some risks were worth taking. Some children were worth saving, even if saving them meant endangering yourself. The afternoon sun slanted through the classroom windows, illuminating a scene of learning and growth that felt like hope made visible. For the first time since leaving the reservation, Catherine allowed herself to imagine that she might have found a place where her true self could exist alongside her necessary disguise. She just hoped she was strong enough to maintain the balance. 3 weeks into her position at the school, Catherine had settled into a routine that felt almost normal. She shared a small room above the classroom with Ruth, helped teach basic arithmetic and reading, and found herself genuinely enjoying the work. The children had accepted her presence with the easy adaptability of youth, and even Elena had begun to warm to her, though their conversations remained carefully guarded. But normalcy, Catherine was learning, was a fragile thing in a frontier town where gossip traveled faster than prairie fire. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning when Catherine arrived at the school to find Margaret Fuller waiting on the front steps. Flanked by 2 other women, Catherine recognized as prominent members of the Ladies' Auxiliary. Their expressions carried the grim satisfaction of people who believed they had uncovered an important truth. "Miss Wells," Margaret said, rising from her position on the steps with theatrical gravity, "we need to have a conversation." Ruth emerged from the schoolhouse, clearly having heard the commotion. "Mrs. Fuller, the children will be arriving soon. Perhaps whatever this is about could wait until after school hours." "I'm afraid it cannot," Margaret replied crisply. "This concerns the welfare of the children directly." Catherine felt her carefully. Constructed world began to tremble. She had been dreading this moment, the inevitable investigation that would expose her deception. But she forced her expression to remain calm, drawing on years of practice in hiding her thoughts. "What seems to be the problem?" Catherine asked, proud that her voice remained steady. Margaret reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "Yesterday, I sent a telegram to Philadelphia, to the church where you claimed your father served as minister." Catherine's heart stopped, but she maintained her composure. "I see." The response was quite illuminating, Margaret continued, unfolding the paper with obvious relish. "There has never been a Reverend Wells at the First Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia. In fact, no one by that name has ever served in any capacity at that church." The words hung in the morning air like an accusation of murder. Catherine was aware of Ruth's sharp intake of breath, of the other women's eager anticipation, of the sound of children's voices in the distance as families brought their students to school. "Perhaps," Catherine said carefully, "there was some confusion about which church. I sent telegrams to 7 Presbyterian churches in Philadelphia." Margaret interrupted triumphantly. "None of them have any record of a Reverend Wells or his daughter Catherine." Ruth stepped forward, her loyalty to Catherine evident despite the damning revelation. "Mrs. Fuller, even if there's been some misunderstanding about Miss Wells' background, she's been an excellent teacher. The children adore her, and her work has been exemplary. Her work may be adequate, said Mrs. Henderson, one of Margaret's companions, but her deception calls into question everything about her character. What kind of woman lies about her entire past? The kind who has no choice, Catherine thought bitterly. The kind who would rather starve than watch her heritage used as an excuse to deny her basic humanity. I think, said a new voice from behind them, that we should hear Miss Wells' explanation before we rush to judgment. Everyone turned to see Dr. Mitchell approaching, his medical bag in hand and his expression serious but not unkind. Catherine felt a flutter of gratitude, though she wondered how much his support would matter once the full truth emerged. Dr. Mitchell, Margaret said with barely concealed annoyance, surely even you cannot defend deliberate fraud. I can defend giving someone a chance to explain themselves, he replied calmly. Miss Wells, would you like to tell us what's really going on? Catherine looked around the circle of faces, Margaret's triumphant hostility, Mrs. Henderson's righteous indignation, Ruth's worried loyalty, Dr. Mitchell's careful neutrality. In the distance, she could see the first families arriving with their children, who would soon witness whatever public humiliation was about to unfold. For 3 weeks, she had lived with the constant fear of this moment. Now that it had arrived, she found herself oddly calm. The worst had happened, and somehow she was still standing. You're right, she said quietly. I'm not Catherine Wells, daughter of a Presbyterian minister from Philadelphia. Margaret made a small sound of vindication, but Catherine continued before she could speak. My name is Catherine Runningwolf. My father was a Comanche warrior named Running Bear. My mother was a white woman named Mary Sullivan, who was captured during a raid when she was 16 and chose to stay with the tribe when she was given the chance to leave. The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine could hear the wind moving through the oak trees that shaded the schoolhouse, the distant sound of children's laughter, the nervous shifting of the women around her. Dear God, Mrs. Henderson whispered, you're a half-breed. The ugly word hit Catherine like a physical blow, but she refused to flinch. She had heard it countless times before, used like a weapon to cut her away from both sides of her heritage. I am a woman of mixed heritage, Catherine corrected with quiet dignity. I was raised by both my parents until I was 7, when government agents took me to a boarding school designed to civilize Indian children. I spent 10 years there, learning to read and write and speak proper English and suppress every trace of my father's culture. Ruth's face had gone pale, but her eyes showed understanding rather than revulsion. That's why you're so good with Elena, she said softly. You know exactly what she's going through. I know what it's like to be told that half of yourself is wrong, Catherine agreed. I know what it's like to be caught between 2 worlds that each insist you must choose only one. Dr. Mitchell had been listening with the careful attention he brought to difficult diagnoses. What happened after the boarding school? I went to San Antonio, where I worked as a seamstress for 5 years, Catherine continued. I saved every penny I could, trying to make a life for myself. But no matter how well I spoke English or how properly I dressed, my heritage was always visible to those who looked closely. I was too Indian for white society and too assimilated to return to the reservation. So you decided to lie about who you were, Margaret said coldly. I decided to become someone who could survive, Catherine replied. When I saw Samuel Morrison's advertisement for a mail-order bride, I saw a chance to start over somewhere where my past wouldn't follow me. By deceiving an honest man, Mrs. Henderson added. Catherine felt anger flare in her chest, but she kept her voice level. By trying to build a life where I could be useful and respected, instead of despised for circumstances I had no control over. Margaret stepped forward, her expression hard with righteous certainty. Miss Runningwolf or Wells or whatever you choose to call yourself, you cannot seriously expect us to allow you to continue teaching our children. Your deception proves you cannot be trusted. Why? The question came from an unexpected source, Elena Vasquez, who had approached during the confrontation, and now stood listening with the other arriving children. "Elena," Ruth said gently, "this is an adult conversation. Why can't she be trusted?" Elena repeated, her young voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone present. "Because she's part Indian like me? Because she had to pretend to be white to get people to treat her like a human being?" Margaret's face flushed. "Young lady, you have no business interfering in this discussion." "I have every business," Elena replied with fierce dignity. "Miss Wells is the first teacher who ever made me feel like being Comanche was something to be proud of instead of ashamed of. She's the first adult who ever told me that my mother's people had wisdom worth learning." Catherine felt tears threaten as Elena continued speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You want to fire her because she lied about being white? Well, maybe that tells you something about how we treat people who aren't white. Maybe that tells you why someone would feel like they had to lie." "Elena," Catherine said softly, "you don't have to." "Yes, I do," the girl interrupted. "Because if they can throw you away for being what you are, they can throw me away too. And all the other children who don't fit into their neat little boxes." Dr. Mitchell had been watching this exchange with growing interest. Now he spoke up, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Elena raises an important point," he said. "Miss Running-Wolf's deception was born of necessity, not malice. She needed to survive in a society that judges people by their bloodline rather than their character." "Dr. Mitchell," Margaret said with exasperation, "surely you cannot be defending—" "I'm defending a woman who has proven herself to be an excellent teacher and a positive influence on our children," he replied firmly. "The fact that she felt compelled to hide her heritage says more about us than it does about her." Ruth stepped closer to Catherine, a gesture of solidarity that spoke louder than words. "Margaret, in 3 weeks, Catherine has improved our students' reading levels, helped solve discipline problems with patience and creativity, and brought a perspective to our curriculum that we desperately needed." "But she lied," Mrs. Henderson began. "She protected herself," Ruth corrected. "Just like any of us would if we faced the choice between honesty and survival." Catherine looked around the circle again, seeing the battle lines being drawn. Margaret and her allies remained convinced that deception trumped competence. Ruth and Dr. Mitchell seemed willing to judge her by her actions rather than her ancestry. But the real test would come from the parents of her students, who were now arriving to witness this very public examination of her fitness to teach their children. "What do you think, folks?" called out a voice from the growing crowd. Catherine turned to see Robert Kimball, a local rancher whose twin sons were among her best students. "Seems to me the question isn't where Miss Catherine comes from, but whether she's good for our kids." A murmur of agreement rose from several parents, but Catherine also heard voices of concern and disapproval. The community was dividing before her eyes, forced to choose between prejudice and pragmatism. "My Jenny's been reading better than ever since Miss Catherine started helping her," added Mrs. Peterson, whose daughter struggled with letters. "I don't care if she came from the moon, long as she keeps helping my girl learn." "That's all well and good," replied Mr. Thompson, whose son was one of the older students. "But what kind of example does it set to let someone stay after they've been caught in lies? How do we trust anything she tells our children?" Catherine realized this was her moment, perhaps her only chance to speak for herself before the verdict was rendered. "Mr. Thompson," she said, stepping forward slightly, "you're right to be concerned about trust. I did lie about my background, and I understand why that troubles you." She paused, looking around at the faces of parents who had entrusted their children to her care. "But I want you to consider something. For 3 weeks, I've taught your children. I've been honest with them about mathematics and reading and writing. I've encouraged them to ask questions and think for themselves. I've treated each of them with respect and kindness." Catherine's voice grew stronger as she continued. "The lie I told was about my past, not about my commitment to your children's education. I hid my heritage because experience taught me that people judge based on blood rather than character. but everything I've done in this classroom has been genuine." Elena moved to stand beside Catherine, followed by several other students who had been listening to the adult conversation with wide eyes. "Miss Catherine taught me that being different doesn't mean being wrong," said 9-year-old Tommy Brennan. "She helped me understand that my stutter doesn't make me stupid. She showed me how to help the younger kids instead of just being frustrated with them," added Sarah Martinez, one of the older girls. One by one, several students spoke up, describing how Catherine had helped them, encouraged them, or simply made them feel valued. Their voices carried a weight that adult arguments couldn't match. Margaret Fuller listened to these testimonials with growing frustration, clearly realizing that her campaign to remove Catherine was losing ground. "Children," she said sharply, "you don't understand the larger implications." "I understand perfectly," Elena interrupted. "You want to punish Miss Catherine for having Indian blood, just like people want to punish me for having Mexican and Comanche blood. Just like they want to punish anyone who doesn't look exactly like you." The girl's words cut through the morning air like a blade, exposing the ugliness beneath Margaret's righteous indignation. Dr. Mitchell cleared his throat. "I think we need to make a decision here. Miss Running Wolf has been honest with us about her deception and her motivations. The children clearly benefit from her teaching. The question is whether we're going to let prejudice override practical results." "I vote she stays," called out Robert Kimball. "Seconded," added Mrs. Peterson. "Now wait just a minute," Margaret began. "All in favor of keeping Miss Catherine as our teacher?" Dr. Mitchell called out, effectively turning the informal gathering into an impromptu vote. Catherine watched as hands rose around the circle, some quickly, some hesitantly, but more than she had dared to hope. When the count was taken, she had won by a margin of 2 votes. It wasn't an overwhelming victory, but it was enough. Margaret Fuller's face had turned an unbecoming shade of red. "This is a mistake," she declared. "Mark my words, no good will come of keeping a deceptive half-breed around our children." "Mrs. Fuller," Dr. Mitchell said quietly, "I think you've said enough." As the crowd began to disperse and children headed into the schoolhouse for the day's lessons, Catherine found herself surrounded by supporters, offering words of encouragement and welcome. But even as she smiled and thanked them for their kindness, Catherine understood that the real test was just beginning. She had won the right to stay, but she had also made enemies who would be watching for any excuse to remove her. The battle for acceptance was far from over. In fact, it had probably just begun. The weeks following Catherine's public revelation brought an uneasy peace to Cedar Ridge. Those who had voted to keep her as teacher maintained their support, but the underlying tensions in the community simmered like a pot left too long on the fire. Margaret Fuller's faction had retreated but not surrendered, and Catherine could feel their watchful eyes, tracking her every movement through town. It was during this fragile period that word arrived of trouble brewing in the surrounding countryside, trouble that would test Catherine's place in the community far more severely than any town meeting ever could. The news came on a Thursday evening when Catherine was helping Elena with advanced arithmetic problems after regular school hours. They were working by lamplight in the quiet classroom when the sound of galloping horses interrupted their concentration. Through the window, Catherine could see riders approaching fast, their urgency evident even in the growing darkness. "Miss Catherine," Elena said quietly, setting down her pencil. "Those are ranch hands from the Bradshaw place. Something's wrong." Catherine moved to the window, recognizing the distinctive paint horse ridden by Jake Bradshaw, the foreman of one of the largest spreads in the county. Behind him rode 3 other men, their faces grim with whatever news they carried. Ruth emerged from the kitchen, where she had been preparing tomorrow's lessons. "What's all the commotion?" Before Catherine could answer, Jake Bradshaw burst through the schoolhouse door without knocking, his hat in his hands and his weathered face etched with worry. "Miss Mitchell, Miss Catherine," he said breathlessly. "We need help. Comanche raiders hit the Morrison homestead this afternoon. Families missing, house burned to the ground. The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. After months of relative peace, the specter of Indian raids had returned to terrorize the countryside. But what made it worse was the certain knowledge that this attack would be blamed on all Indians, including those like herself who had never lifted a weapon against white settlers. "Dear God," Ruth whispered. "The Morrison family, how many?" "Tom and Sarah Morrison, their 3 young ones," Jake replied. Neighbors found the place burning around sunset. No sign of the family, but there were tracks leading north toward the hills. Elena had gone very still beside Catherine, understanding as clearly as she did what this meant for anyone of Indian heritage in the region. When fear and anger took hold of frontier communities, innocent people often paid the price for others' crimes. "How do you know it was Comanche?" Catherine asked, though she dreaded the answer. Jake's expression grew uncomfortable. "Well, there were ... signs, arrows left behind, war paint on the barn walls. Plus, old Miguel from the Garcia ranch said he saw warriors heading north yesterday, painted for war." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Something about Jake's description felt wrong, too neat, too obvious. Raiding parties didn't typically leave clear signs of their identity. Stealth and speed were their greatest advantages. "Jake," Ruth said, "practical as always. What kind of help do you need?" "Sheriff's organizing a posse to track them down," Jake explained. "But we need someone who can read sign, understand how they think, maybe help us figure out where they'd take captives." The request hung in the air like a loaded gun. They wanted Catherine's expertise as someone with Comanche heritage, but that same heritage made her suspect in their eyes. It was an impossible position: help hunt her father's people, or be seen as complicit in their crimes. "I'll go," Catherine said quietly. "Catherine, no," Ruth protested immediately. "It's too dangerous, and besides I'm part Indian." "Myself," Catherine finished. "Which means some people will wonder whose side I'm really on." Elena looked up from her arithmetic with eyes far too wise for her 12 years. "They'll blame all of us," she said matter-of-factly. "Even if we had nothing to do with it." Jake shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the truth in Elena's words. "Miss Catherine, I want you to know that my boss, Mr. Bradshaw, he voted for you to stay on as teacher. He thinks you're good people, regardless of ... well, regardless." "I appreciate that, Jake," Catherine replied. "But the question is whether Sheriff Hawkins will see it the same way." As if summoned by her words, the sound of more horses announced the arrival of additional riders. Through the window, Catherine could see Sheriff Tom Hawkins leading a group of armed men toward the schoolhouse. Their faces, illuminated by torchlight, showed the hard determination of men preparing for violence. Sheriff Hawkins dismounted and strode toward the schoolhouse, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. He was a big man, probably close to 50, with gray hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to catalog threats automatically. "Evening, folks," he said, touching his hat brim to Ruth while his gaze fixed on Catherine. "I reckon you've heard about the Morrison family." "Jake just told us," Ruth replied. "It's terrible news." "That it is," Hawkins agreed. "Now I understand we've got someone here who might be able to help us track these raiders." His eyes never left Catherine's face as he spoke, and she understood that this wasn't really a request. In a crisis like this, refusing to help would be seen as confirmation of divided loyalty. "I'm willing to assist however I can," Catherine said carefully. "Though I should mention that my knowledge comes from childhood memories and stories, not recent experience." "Childhood memories of what exactly?" asked a voice from the group of riders. Catherine turned to see Marcus Webb, one of Margaret Fuller's allies, dismounting from his horse with obvious suspicion written across his features. Webb owned a small but prosperous ranch and had been one of the loudest voices arguing for Catherine's dismissal. "Memories of how my father's people moved through this country," Catherine replied evenly. Traditional camping spots, water sources, routes through. The hills that offered concealment. Your father's people, Webb repeated with obvious distaste. And how do we know you won't lead us into an ambush? How do we know you're not in league with these raiders? The accusation hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the atmosphere and forcing everyone to choose sides. Catherine felt Alina move. Closer to her, the girl's instinctive loyalty, both touching and dangerous. Sheriff Hawkins held up a hand before anyone else could speak. Webb, that's enough. Miss Catherine has been living peaceful in our community for weeks now. No reason to think she's involved with raiders. No reason except blood, Webb shot back. Everyone knows Indians stick together when push comes to shove. Catherine felt anger flare in her chest, but before she could respond, Dr. Mitchell appeared in the doorway. He must have heard the commotion and come to investigate. Gentlemen, he said with the calm authority that came from years of dealing with emergencies, if you're here to ask for Miss Catherine's help, then I suggest you do so respectfully. If you're here to make accusations, then you can take them. Elsewhere, Webb's face flushed. Doctor, with all due respect, you weren't at the Morrison place. You didn't see what those savages did. And neither did you, Dr. Mitchell replied coolly. You saw the aftermath. There's a difference. Sheriff Hawkins stepped between them before the argument could escalate. We're wasting time. Miss Catherine, are you willing to ride with us? We could use someone who understands how war parties think. Catherine looked around the circle of faces, Jake's hopeful desperation, Webb's open hostility, the sheriff's careful neutrality, Dr. Mitchell's supportive concern. Through the window, she could see more townspeople gathering, drawn by the commotion, and the promise of dramatic action. I'll help, she said finally, but I want to be clear about something. If we do encounter Comanche raiders, I'll do everything in my power to help recover the Morrison family safely. But I won't participate in indiscriminate violence against people who might be innocent. Fair enough, Sheriff Hawkins agreed, though Webb made a sound of disgust. When do we leave? Catherine asked. Dawn, the sheriff replied. That'll give you us enough light to follow the trail while it's still fresh. As the men began to disperse to make their preparations, Dr. Mitchell approached Catherine privately. Are you sure about this? He asked quietly. You're putting yourself in considerable danger, and not just from potential raiders. Catherine glanced toward Webb, who was speaking in low, angry tones to several other men. I know, but if I refuse to help, it'll be seen as proof that I can't be trusted. And if the Morrison family is still alive, my knowledge might be the key to finding them. There's something else, Dr. Mitchell said, lowering his voice further. I've been thinking about Jake's description of the raid. Something doesn't sit right. What do you mean? Comanche raiders don't typically leave calling cards. They strike fast and disappear. Why would they paint war symbols on a barn and leave arrows behind for people to find? Catherine had been thinking the same thing, but hearing her suspicions, confirmed by someone else, made them more concrete. You think this might not be what it appears? I think, Dr. Mitchell said carefully, that you should be very careful tomorrow, and not just because of potential raiders. That night, Catherine lay awake in her small room above the classroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to prepare herself for whatever the morning might bring. Through the thin walls, she could hear Alina tossing restlessly in the next room, the girl's sleep disturbed by the same fears that kept Catherine wakeful. Outside, the town was unusually quiet, as if Cedar Ridge itself was holding its breath. But in that silence, Catherine could hear the whispered conversations of men preparing for violence, the click of weapons being cleaned and loaded, the nervous stamping of horses sensing their riders' tension. She thought about the Morrison family, Tom Morrison, a quiet man who ran a small but successful farm. His wife Sarah, who brought fresh eggs to trade in town every week. Their 3 children, ages 6, 9, and 12. If they were still alive, they were probably terrified, confused, possibly injured. But Catherine also thought about the Comanche warriors who might be blamed for their disappearance. Were they actually responsible, or were they about to become scapegoats for someone else's crimes? And if she helped the posse track down innocent people, what would that make her? As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through her window, Catherine rose and dressed carefully. She chose her most practical clothes, sturdy boots, divided riding skirt, and a jacket that would protect her from thorns and weather. In her saddlebags, she packed water, jerky, and the small knife that was her only weapon. But most importantly, she prepared herself mentally for the possibility that today might be the day her carefully rebuilt life came crashing down around her. If things went badly, if violence erupted, if Webb's suspicions gained credence, she might find herself running again, this time not just from poverty and prejudice, but from accusations of treason and collaboration. Thought Ruth was waiting in the kitchen. When Catherine came downstairs, a cup of coffee and plate of biscuits ready despite the early hour. "Eat something," Ruth said without preamble. "You'll need your strength." "Ruth," Catherine began, wanting to express her gratitude for everything the teacher had done for her. "Don't," Ruth interrupted gently. "Don't talk like you're not coming back. You're going to help find that family, and then you're going to come home where you belong." The simple faith in Ruth's words was almost overwhelming. Catherine had never had someone believe in her so completely. Never had someone call her actions home, without reservation or condition. "Thank you," Catherine said quietly, "for everything." Elena appeared in the doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour. "I want to go with you." "Absolutely not," Catherine replied immediately. "I can read sign as well as you can," Elena argued. "My father taught me to track before he decided I needed to act more like a white girl." "Elena, it's too dangerous." "Everything is dangerous for people like us," the girl replied with devastating logic. "At least this way, I'd be helping instead of just waiting to be blamed for something I didn't do." Catherine saw too much of herself in Elena's fierce determination. The same desperate need to prove worth through action rather than simply enduring judgment. "The answer is still no," Catherine said firmly. "But Elena... If something happens to me, if I don't come back, you need to know that you are exactly who you're supposed to be. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The sound of horses gathering in the street interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Catherine could see the posse assembling, perhaps 20 men on horseback, armed and ready for whatever they might find in the hills. Sheriff Hawkins sat his horse with professional calm, but Webb and his supporters moved with the barely contained aggression of men looking for a fight. Catherine understood that she would be riding not just into potential danger from raiders, but into the heart of her community's deepest prejudices and fears. As she stepped outside into the cool morning air, Catherine Running Wolf, teacher, survivor, woman caught between worlds, prepared to face whatever truth lay hidden in the hills beyond Cedar Ridge. The Morrison family's fate hung in the balance. But so did her own future and the fragile acceptance she had fought so hard to achieve. The morning sun cast long shadows across the burned remains of the Morrison homestead as the posse arrived to begin their tracking. Catherine sat astride a borrowed mare, studying the scene with eyes trained by childhood lessons she had hoped never to use. What she saw confirmed Dr. Mitchell's suspicions and filled her with a cold dread that had nothing to do with the destruction before them. Farmhouse was indeed burned to its foundation, wisps of smoke still rising from the charred timbers. The barn had been partially destroyed, its walls blackened by fire. Scattered around the yard were the remnants of a family's life, a child's wooden toy, a woman's shawl, broken crockery that had once graced the Morrison dinner table. But it was what Catherine didn't see that troubled her most. "Sheriff," she called quietly, dismounting to examine the ground more closely. "May I look at these tracks Jake mentioned?" Hawkins nodded, following her to the area behind the barn where the supposed war party's trail began. Catherine knelt in the dirt, running her fingers over the hoofprints while a dozen armed men watched her every movement. The tracks were there, clear enough unshod horse hooves heading north toward the hill country. But something about them felt wrong, artificial, like a story someone wanted her to read rather than signs left by genuine raiders. "What do you see?" Sheriff Hawkins asked. Catherine stood, brushing dirt from her hands while choosing her words carefully. "The tracks lead north," as Jake said. "Perhaps 8 to 10 horses, moving at a steady pace rather than the hard gallop you'd expect from raiders fleeing the scene. Maybe they weren't in a hurry," suggested Webb from his position near the burned barn. "Maybe they figured they had time before anyone discovered what they'd done." Catherine walked closer to the barn, studying the war paint symbols that had been daubed on the surviving wall. Her heart sank as she recognized what she was seeing. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "I need to show you something." Hawkins approached, leaving his horse with one of the other men. Catherine pointed to the painted symbols' crude representations of birds and lightning bolts in red and black paint. "These symbols," she said carefully, "they're not Comanche." "What do you mean?" Catherine traced one of the designs with her finger. "This is a thunderbird symbol used by Plains Cree tribes, hundreds of miles north of here. And this lightning pattern, it's Lakota, from the Dakota Territories. No single Comanche war party would use symbols from 3 different tribes." A murmur of confusion rippled through the assembled men. Webb pushed forward, his face flushed with anger. "You're trying to confuse us," he accused. "Trying to throw us off the trail of your people." "My people," Catherine replied evenly, "would never leave such obvious signs. War parties survive through stealth and speed, not by advertising their presence with painted symbols." Sheriff Hawkins studied the painted wall with new interest. "So what are you saying? That this wasn't done by Indians?" "I'm saying," Catherine replied carefully, "that whoever did this wanted it to look like the work of multiple tribes. Someone who knew enough to paint Indian symbols, but not enough to know which tribes use which designs." Jake Bradshaw had been listening to this exchange with growing unease. "Miss Catherine, are you suggesting that white men did this? That they made it look like an Indian raid?" Catherine looked around the circle of faces, seeing confusion, suspicion, and in Webb's case, naked hostility. What she was suggesting challenged everything they thought they knew about the attack. "I'm suggesting we follow the evidence wherever it leads," she said diplomatically, "including these tracks." What followed was the most tense morning of Catherine's life. As the posse made its way north through increasingly rough terrain, she found herself walking a knife's edge between helping the search and avoiding accusations of misdirection. Every observation she made was scrutinized for signs of deception, every suggestion questioned for hidden motives. The trail led them through scrub oak and mesquite, up rocky slopes where the tracks became harder to follow. Catherine rode slightly ahead of the main group, reading sign while acutely aware of the rifles and pistols behind her. More than once, she caught Webb watching her with undisguised suspicion. "Trail's getting harder to follow," she called back after 2 hours of riding. "The ground's too rocky to hold clear prints." "Convenient," Webb muttered, loud enough to be heard. "Real convenient that the trail goes cold when our Indian guide is leading us." Sheriff Hawkins reined in beside Catherine. "What do you think? Can you pick up the trail again?" Catherine studied the terrain, ahead a maze of rocky outcroppings and narrow canyons that would challenge even an experienced tracker. But something else caught her attention, a glint of metal among the rocks to their left. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "there's something over there you should see." They found it wedged between 2 boulders, a cavalry bridle, U.S. Army issue, with fresh scratches on the metal that suggested it had been deliberately damaged and hidden. The discovery sent shockwaves through the posse. Military equipment at the scene of an Indian raid suggested possibilities that no one wanted to contemplate. "Could have been dropped by the raiders," Webb said, but his voice lacked conviction. Could have been taken in some other attack. Catherine examined the bridle more closely. The leather isn't weathered. This wasn't lying out here long, maybe a day or two at most. Dr. Mitchell, who had joined the posse despite protests from his sister about leaving his medical practice, dismounted to look at the bridle himself. "This is standard issue," he said grimly. "Current regulation, not surplus from the war." The implications hung heavy in the morning air. If current military equipment was involved in the Morrison attack, then either active soldiers were responsible or someone with access to army supplies was trying to confuse the investigation. "We need to keep following the trail," Sheriff Hawkins decided, "but we also need to consider that this situation might be more complicated than we first thought." As they prepared to continue tracking, Catherine noticed movement in the distance riders approaching from the east at considerable speed. Through the heat shimmer, she could make out at least 6 horsemen heading directly toward their position. "Company coming," she called out, pointing toward the approaching riders. The posse immediately shifted into defensive positions, weapons ready for potential trouble. But as the riders drew closer, Catherine could see they wore the blue uniforms of the U.S. Cavalry. "Those are soldiers," Jake observed unnecessarily. The cavalry patrol was led by a lieutenant who appeared to be in his mid-20s, with sandy hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. Behind him rode 5 enlisted men, all armed and alert. "Afternoon, Sheriff," the lieutenant called out as he approached. "I'm Lieutenant David Harrison, Fort Conco. We heard there was Indian trouble in this area." Sheriff Hawkins rode forward. "To meet them, Lieutenant. We're tracking raiders who hit the Morrison homestead yesterday. Took the family, burned them out. Any idea which tribe?" Catherine found herself the focus of attention again as Hawkins gestured in her direction. "Miss Catherine here has been helping us read sign. She's got experience with Indian ways." "Lieutenant." Harrison's gaze fixed on Catherine with professional interest. "Miss, what can you tell me about these raiders?" Catherine felt the weight of a dozen gazes as she considered how to answer. The truth about the mixed tribal symbols would cast doubt on the entire raid story. But lying would make her complicit in whatever deception was unfolding. "The evidence is inconsistent," she said carefully. "The tracks are clear enough, but other details don't match typical raiding patterns." "What kind of inconsistencies?" Before Catherine could answer, Webb interrupted with barely contained frustration. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, Miss Catherine here is half Indian herself. Some of us aren't sure we can trust her assessment of the situation." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Catherine felt her carefully constructed world teetering on the edge of collapse once again. But to her surprise, Lieutenant Harrison's expression grew thoughtful rather than suspicious. "Half Indian," he repeated. "Which tribe?" "Comanche," Catherine admitted, bracing for the reaction. Instead of hostility, Harrison's face showed what appeared to be relief. "Miss, I need to ask you something directly, and I need an honest answer. In your opinion, based on your knowledge of Comanche raiding practices, does this attack fit the pattern of a genuine war party?" The question caught everyone off guard. The lieutenant wasn't asking whether Catherine could be trusted, he was asking for her professional assessment as someone with cultural knowledge. "No," Catherine said after a moment's hesitation. "It doesn't. Why not?" Catherine took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either vindicate her or destroy her credibility entirely. "The painted symbols are from 3 different tribes that would never raid together. The tracks show horses moving at a steady pace rather than the hard gallop typical of raiders. The timing is wrong. War parties usually strike at dawn or dusk, not mid-afternoon. And most importantly, the attack itself seems designed to send a message rather than achieve tactical objectives." Lieutenant Harrison nodded grimly. "That matches our intelligence. Miss, we've been tracking a group of deserters from Fort Conco who've been staging fake Indian raids to cover their rustling operations. They steal cattle and horses, burn homesteads to eliminate witnesses, and leave false evidence to blame. Local tribes. The revelation hit the posse like a thunderbolt. Catherine felt vindicated, but also terrified. If the attackers were army deserters rather than Indians, then the Morrison family was in even greater danger. Deserters, Sheriff Hawkins repeated. How many? 7 men, led by a former sergeant. Named Black Pete Morrison, no relation to your missing family. They've hit 3 ranches in the past month, always leaving Indian sign to throw off pursuit. Webb's face had gone pale. You're saying white men took the Morrison family? I'm saying, Harrison replied, that we've been tracking these criminals for weeks, and this attack fits their pattern exactly. If we're right, the real question is whether they took the family as hostages or... He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood the implication. Criminals eliminating witnesses would have little use for living captives. Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Lieutenant, if these men are desperate enough to kill entire families, they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who gets too close to them. Which is why, Harrison said grimly, we need to track them down quickly. Miss, would you be willing to continue helping us? Your ability to distinguish real Indian sign from false evidence could be crucial. Catherine looked around the circle of faces, seeing the situation from an entirely new perspective. She was no longer a suspected Indian sympathizer, she was a valuable resource in hunting down white criminals who were murdering innocent families. Of course, she said. But Lieutenant, if we're dealing with desperate men, we need to be prepared for the possibility that they'll fight rather than surrender. Oh, they'll fight, Harrison agreed. Black Pete Morrison would rather die than hang, and he's got nothing left to lose. As the combined posse and cavalry patrol prepared to continue tracking, Catherine found herself riding beside Dr. Mitchell, who had been unusually quiet during the lieutenant's revelations. You were right to suspect the evidence, she said quietly. I was right to trust your judgment, he replied. Catherine, what you did back there, standing up for the truth even when it put you at risk, that took real courage. Catherine felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. For the first time since leaving the reservation, she felt like someone truly saw her for who she was rather than what they expected her to be. But the warmth was tempered by growing dread about what they might find at the end of this trail. The Morrison family had been missing for almost 24 hours now. If Black Pete Morrison and his gang were as ruthless as Lieutenant Harrison suggested, time was running out for any survivors. As they rode deeper into the hill country, following tracks that now seemed clearly intentional rather than accidentally left, Catherine found herself praying to the spirits of her father's people and the God of her mother's faith. She prayed for the Morrison family's survival, for the strength to see this through, and for the wisdom to navigate whatever deadly confrontation lay ahead. Behind them, the settlement of Cedar Ridge seemed like another world, a place where her biggest concern had been teaching children arithmetic and earning acceptance from skeptical neighbors. Ahead lay violence, danger, and the chance to prove once and for all that her loyalty belonged not to any particular race or culture, but to justice itself. The trail led them deeper into the Badlands, where wind-carved stone formations created a labyrinth of hidden canyons and secret passages. Catherine rode point with Lieutenant Harrison, her eyes scanning the rocky ground for signs, while her mind worked through the tactical challenges ahead. The deserters had chosen their hideout well. This was country where a small group could hold off a much larger force, using the terrain itself as a weapon. There, Catherine said quietly, pointing to a narrow gap between 2 towering red rock spires. The tracks disappear into that canyon. Harrison studied the terrain with a soldier's eye, noting how the canyon mouth could easily become a killing field for anyone foolish enough to charge in blindly. Natural fortress, he murmured. Probably multiple escape routes through the back country. Behind them, the combined posse had grown to nearly 30, men as word of the deserters spread and additional volunteers joined the hunt. But Catherine, worried that numbers might work against them, too many men made stealth impossible, and stealth might be their only advantage. "Lieutenant," she said, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear, "if the Morrison family is still alive, a direct assault will get them killed. What do you suggest?" Catherine studied the canyon walls, noting the ledges and crevices that could conceal a careful climber. Years of childhood games with her Comanche cousins had taught her to see routes that trained soldiers might miss. "Give me 2 men who can climb and move quietly," she said. "We scout the canyon, locate the hostages if they're still alive, and create a diversion while you bring the main force around to block the escape routes." Harrison's eyebrows rose. "Miss Catherine, that's extremely dangerous. If you're caught—" "If we don't try, the Morrison family dies anyway," Catherine replied. "These men are cornered and desperate. They know they'll hang if they're taken alive. Their only choices are to fight their way out or eliminate all witnesses." Dr. Mitchell had ridden up close enough to overhear their conversation. "Catherine, please reconsider. You're not a soldier." "No," she agreed, "but I know this country better than any soldier. I know how to move without being seen, how to read the land, how to get close enough to matter." The debate was interrupted by a shout from one of the men watching the canyon mouth. Through the afternoon heat shimmer, they could see smoke rising from somewhere deep within the hidden valley, not the gray smoke of a cooking fire, but the black smoke that meant something larger was burning. "They're destroying evidence," Harrison said grimly, "probably getting ready to move." Catherine felt her heart race. If the deserters were preparing to abandon their hideout, they would have no reason to keep the Morrison family alive. Every minute of delay could be fatal. "Sheriff," Harrison called out, "we need to move now." "Miss Catherine, if you're serious about scouting that canyon, this is our only chance." Catherine looked around the group, noting how Webb and several others watched her with renewed suspicion. Even with Lieutenant Harrison's endorsement, some still questioned whether she could be trusted in a life-or-death situation. "I volunteer to go with her," Dr. Mitchell said suddenly. Catherine turned to stare at him. "James, you're not—" "I'm not a soldier or a tracker," he agreed, "but I am the only doctor within 50 miles. If the Morrison family is injured, they'll need medical attention immediately." Harrison nodded approvingly. "Good point. Anyone else?" To Catherine's surprise, Jake Bradshaw stepped forward. "I'll go. I know these hills pretty well, and I owe it to the Morrison family. Tom helped me through a bad winter 2 years back." With their small reconnaissance team assembled, Catherine found herself leading 2 men she barely knew into what could easily become a deadly trap. As they prepared to enter the canyon, Sheriff Hawkins pulled her aside. "Miss Catherine," he said quietly, "I want you to know that whatever happens in there, you've already proven yourself to this community. Webb and his friends can say what they want, but you've shown your true colors." The words meant more to Catherine than she could express. After months of fighting for acceptance, she was finally being judged by her actions rather than her heritage. "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied. "Just ... if something goes wrong, please tell Elena that she should never be ashamed of who she is." The canyon entrance was even more forbidding up close. The gap between the rock walls was barely wide enough for 2 horses to pass side by side, and the floor was littered with boulders that would provide perfect cover for defenders. Catherine dismounted and examined the ground, finding fresh horse droppings and boot prints that confirmed their quarry had indeed passed this way. "They're definitely in there," she whispered to her companions. "But I don't see any guards posted." "At the entrance, overconfident?" Dr. Mitchell suggested. "Or they have lookouts further in," Catherine replied. "We go on foot from here." What followed was the most terrifying hour of Catherine's life. Moving like shadows through the canyon, they crept past towering walls that seemed to press in from both sides. The sound of their breathing seemed impossibly loud in the confined space, and every loose stone that shifted under their feet might as well have been a gunshot. The canyon twisted and turned, creating blind corners where armed men could be waiting just out of sight. But Catherine's childhood training served her well. She could read the subtle signs that indicated whether the path ahead was clear or potentially dangerous. After what felt like miles but was probably only a few hundred yards, the canyon began to widen. Through a gap in the rocks ahead, Catherine could see open sky and smell wood smoke mixed with something else, something that made her stomach turn. She held up a hand to halt her companions, then crept forward alone to peer through the gap. What she saw made her blood run cold. The canyon opened into a hidden valley, perhaps half a mile across, with a small stream running through its center. Near the water, a ramshackle camp had been established with tents, corrals for stolen horses, and fire pits for cooking. It was clearly a well-established operation, not a temporary hideout. But what drew Catherine's attention was the cluster of buildings at the far end of the valley, an abandoned mining operation with wooden structures still partially intact. And tied up outside the largest building, clearly visible even at this distance, were 4 figures that had to be the Morrison family. Catherine's heart leaped with relief. They were alive, at least for now. But her relief quickly turned to urgency as she counted the men moving around the camp. 7 figures, just as Lieutenant Harrison had predicted. And from their behavior, the rapid packing of supplies, the saddling of horses, they were definitely preparing to move. She crept back to where Dr. Mitchell and Jake waited, her mind racing through possibilities. "They're alive," she whispered. "All 4 of them, tied up near some old mining buildings. But there are 7 deserters, and they're getting ready to leave. How long do we have?" Jake asked. Catherine thought about what she had observed. "Maybe an hour, probably less. We need to get word back to Harrison immediately." "I'll go," Jake volunteered. "You and the doc figure out how to get closer to the prisoners." As Jake began the dangerous journey back through the canyon, Catherine and Dr. Mitchell settled in to watch the camp and look for opportunities. The deserters were clearly professional soldiers, even if they were criminals now. Their movements showed military discipline. Their weapons were well maintained, and their defensive positions were expertly chosen. "This isn't going to be easy," Dr. Mitchell observed. "No," Catherine agreed. "But look there, see how they've positioned themselves. They're watching the main approaches to the valley, but they're not paying attention to those rock ledges on the eastern wall." Dr. Mitchell followed her gaze to where a series of natural terraces climbed the canyon wall like a giant staircase. "You think we could get close enough to matter from up there?" "I think," Catherine said, studying the layout more carefully, "that someone who knew how to move quietly could get very close indeed." What she didn't say was that someone would have to be her. Dr. Mitchell was brave and well-meaning, but he didn't have the skills needed for what she was contemplating. And what she was contemplating was extremely dangerous. As they watched, one of the deserters approached the Morrison family. Even at a distance, Catherine could see the man's aggressive posture, the way the prisoners cringed away from him. He was saying something that clearly terrified them. "We're running out of time," Catherine said urgently. "James, I need you to stay here and signal Harrison when he arrives. I'm going to try to get closer." "Catherine, absolutely not." "Look at them," Catherine interrupted, pointing toward the prisoners. "They're terrified. That man isn't just guarding them, he's threatening them. If we wait for a full assault, they'll be killed before Harrison's men can reach them." Dr. Mitchell grabbed her arm. "And if you're caught, you'll be killed too. Catherine, please think about this rationally." "I am thinking rationally," she replied, though her heart was pounding with fear. "I'm thinking that Tom Morrison helped Jake through a hard winter. I'm thinking that Sarah Morrison brings fresh eggs to town every week and always has a kind word for everyone. I'm thinking that their children don't deserve to die because some soldiers went bad." She was also thinking about Elena, about all the mixed-blood children who faced prejudice and violence simply for existing. If Catherine could save this white family, maybe it would prove once and for all that heritage didn't determine loyalty. There's another reason, she added quietly. If this goes wrong, if the deserters escape and the Morrison family dies, people will blame Indians anyway. They'll say we let it happen because we couldn't be trusted to help hunt down the real criminals. Dr. Mitchell's expression showed that he understood the impossible position she was in. As a woman of Comanche heritage, she would be held responsible for failures in a way that white members of the posse never would be. "How can I help?" he asked finally. Catherine felt a surge of gratitude for his support. Watch for Harrison's signal. When the main assault begins, create as much noise and confusion as you can from this position. Make them think the attack is coming from here while I try to reach the prisoners from the other side. As Catherine prepared to begin her dangerous climb up the eastern wall of the canyon, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate woman fleeing poverty and prejudice, willing to lie about her identity just to survive. Now she was risking her life to save a white family she barely knew, working alongside men who had initially viewed her with suspicion, using skills her Comanche father had taught her, to fight white criminals who were trying to frame her people for their crimes. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to become someone else, she had finally discovered who she really was. As she began to climb, moving from ledge to ledge with the silent grace her childhood had taught her, Catherine Running Wolf carried with her the hopes of two worlds: Comanche heritage that had given her strength, and the frontier community that was slowly learning to accept her as one of their own. Below, in the hidden valley, the Morrison family waited for rescue that might not come in time. Around the canyon, 30 armed men prepared for a battle that could go either way. And somewhere between the two forces, a mixed-blood teacher who had never asked to be a hero, prepared to risk everything for people who would probably never fully understand what she had sacrificed for them. But that, Catherine realized, was what heroism really meant, not seeking glory or recognition, but doing what was right regardless of the cost. The climb up the canyon wall was like ascending into hell. Each handhold had to be tested silently, each footstep placed with deadly precision. One loose rock, one careless sound, and Catherine would bring 7 desperate killers down on not just herself, but on the Morrison family below. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the red stone, making the rock face too hot to touch comfortably, while sweat stung her eyes and made her grip uncertain. Halfway up the wall, Catherine paused on a narrow ledge to catch her breath and assess her progress. Below, the deserters' camp spread out like a map of criminal enterprise. She could see stolen cattle in makeshift corrals, piles of goods obviously looted from other raids, and weapons stacked with military precision. This wasn't the desperate hideout of panicked criminals. It was the organized base of men who had been operating successfully for months. More disturbing was what she could now see clearly of the Morrison family. Tom Morrison's face was swollen from beatings, and his wife Sarah held their youngest child protectively while trying to shield the other two from whatever horrors they had witnessed. The family's terror was palpable even from Catherine's elevated position, but it was the conversation she could now overhear that made her blood run cold. "Told you, Pete, we need to move them tonight," one of the deserters was saying. "Harrison's patrol has been asking too many questions in Millerville. They're getting close." The man called Pete, presumably the Black Pete Morrison, that lieutenant Harrison had mentioned, spat into the dust. "Then we finish this now and head for Mexico. No witnesses, no problems." "What about the kids?" asked another voice. "What about them?" "Dead kids can't identify us any more than dead adults can." Catherine pressed herself against the rock wall, fighting nausea. These men were planning to murder the entire Morrison family within hours, possibly minutes. Whatever plan Lieutenant Harrison was forming would be too late. She resumed climbing with desperate urgency. using techniques her Comanche father had taught her during childhood games that had prepared her for survival without knowing it. The spirits of her ancestors seemed to guide her hands to the right holds, her feet to the secure ledges. She was no longer Catherine Wells, the fake Eastern bride, or even Catherine Running Wolf, the mixed-blood teacher. She was something older and more primal, a warrior moving to protect the innocent. The final approach required her to traverse a horizontal ledge barely 6 inches wide, with a 100-foot drop to the canyon floor below. Catherine forced herself not to look down, focusing instead on the mining building that was now less than 50 yards away. She could hear individual words from the deserters' conversation, could see the expressions on the Morrison children's faces. "Pete's right," one of the men was saying. "We kill them now, burn the bodies, and be across the border before anyone finds the remains." "I still say we should keep the woman alive for a while," suggested another voice with an ugliness that made Catherine's stomach turn. "Long ride to Mexico." "You keep your mind on business," Pete snapped. "We're soldiers, not animals." "We're soldiers," the other man corrected. "Now we're whatever we need to be to survive." Catherine reached the end of the ledge and found herself directly above the mining building where the prisoners were held. The roof was partially collapsed, leaving gaps that might allow her to drop down into the structure. But she could also see that one of the deserters was positioned as a guard just outside the building's entrance. The guard was a young man, probably no older than 20, with the soft face of someone who had never seen real combat before deserting. He held his rifle casually, clearly not expecting trouble from this direction. But killing him would require Catherine to become something she had never been: a killer. Her Comanche father had taught her to hunt, to kill animals for food and survival. But taking a human life was different. A line that once crossed could never be uncrossed. Yet as she watched the Morrison family below, saw the terror in the children's eyes, Catherine understood that some lines existed to be crossed when innocent lives hung in the balance. She had no gun, no knife except the small blade she used for cutting leather and rope. But she did have surprise, training, and desperation that had crystallized into cold determination. Catherine lowered herself through a gap in the roof, moving with the fluid silence that had made her people such effective raiders. The building's interior was filled with broken mining equipment and rotting timber, providing perfect concealment as she worked her way toward the guard position. Through the gaps in the wall, she could see the young deserter more clearly. He was nervous, constantly shifting his weight and checking his rifle. Good nervous men made mistakes, and mistakes created opportunities. The sound of approaching hoofbeats suddenly echoed through the canyon. Catherine felt her heart leap. Lieutenant Harrison was arriving sooner than expected. But that also meant her time had run out completely. "Riders coming!" Someone shouted from across the camp. "Looks like cavalry." The effect on the deserters was immediate and electric. Men scrambled for weapons, shouted orders, and took defensive positions with the efficiency of trained soldiers. But Catherine noticed that Pete's first instinct was to move toward the Morrison family with his sidearm drawn. She couldn't wait any longer. Catherine emerged from the building like a shadow given form, her small knife catching the late afternoon sun. The young guard had turned toward the sound of approaching riders, presenting his back to her position. She moved across the 20 feet between them in absolute silence, years of childhood games serving her in ways no Eastern finishing school ever could have. The guard never knew what hit him. Catherine's blade found the precise spot between his ribs that her father had taught her would drop a deer instantly. The young man collapsed without a sound, his rifle clattering to the ground as Catherine caught his body and lowered it gently. She had taken a human life. The weight of that action would stay with her forever, but there was no time for reflection now. The Morrison family was less than 30 feet away, and Black Pete was moving toward them with obvious lethal intent. Catherine picked up the dead guard's rifle, checked the load, and stepped into the open. "Let them go, Pete," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the camp. The effect was dramatic. 7 men spun toward her voice, weapons rising. But Catherine had positioned herself where shooting at her would risk hitting the prisoners. It was a temporary advantage, but it might be enough. Black Pete was a large man, probably in his 40s, with graying hair and the hard eyes of someone who had seen too much violence. His uniform bore the stripes of a master sergeant, and his bearing still carried military authority despite his criminal status. "Well, well," he said, keeping his pistol trained on Tom Morrison's head. "Looks like we got ourselves a genuine Indian princess. You with the cavalry, sweetheart?" "I'm with Justice," Catherine replied, keeping her rifle aimed at Pete's center mass. "Something you wouldn't recognize." Pete laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Justice? Little girl, justice is what happens when you got the most guns. And right now I got 6 rifles pointed at you." It was true. Catherine could see the other deserters moving to surround her position, using the camp's buildings and equipment for cover. She might get 1 shot, maybe 2, before they cut her down. But at least the Morrison family would have a chance while the criminals were focused on her. "Maybe," Catherine agreed. "But I've got something you don't have." "What's that?" "Back up." The canyon suddenly erupted in gunfire as Lieutenant Harrison's cavalry charge reached the camp. Catherine threw herself behind a water trough as bullets whistled overhead, while the deserters scrambled to respond to attacks from multiple directions. The battle that followed was brief but vicious. The deserters fought with the skill and desperation of men who knew they faced hanging if captured alive. But they were outnumbered 3 to 1, caught in poor defensive positions, and forced to divide their attention between the cavalry assault and Catherine's position near the prisoners. Catherine used the chaos to reach the Morrison family, cutting their bonds while bullets flew overhead. Tom Morrison was barely conscious from his beatings, but Sarah and the children were alert enough to follow Catherine's urgent whispered instructions. "Stay low, move toward those rocks," Catherine commanded, pointing toward a pile of boulders. "That would provide cover. When I say run, you run and don't look back." "What about you?" Sarah Morrison gasped. "I'll be right behind you," Catherine lied. Someone had to provide cover while the family escaped, and she was the only one in position to do it. The gunfight was going badly for the deserters. 3 of them were already down, and the others were being pushed back toward the canyon's rear wall. But Black Pete was still alive, still dangerous, and still focused on eliminating witnesses. "Run!" Catherine shouted to the Morrison family as they scrambled toward safety. Pete broke from cover with his pistol raised, clearly intending to shoot the fleeing prisoners in the back. Catherine didn't hesitate. She stepped into his line of fire and pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and Pete spun around as the bullet took him high in the chest. But he didn't go down wounded and enraged. He turned his weapon toward Catherine with murder in his eyes. For a moment that lasted eternity, they faced each other across 20 feet of blood-soaked ground. Catherine was working the rifle's bolt action, trying to chamber another round, while Pete raised his pistol with grim determination. The shot that ended it came from an unexpected direction. Dr. Mitchell appeared at the canyon's rim, a smoking rifle in his hands and an expression of shocked determination on his face. Pete collapsed backward, his pistol firing harmlessly into the air as he fell. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. Catherine found herself standing in the middle of what had been a criminal camp, surrounded by dead and wounded men, while smoke drifted across the canyon like fog. The Morrison family was safe behind their rocky shelter, and Lieutenant Harrison's men were securing the area. But the woman who stood there was no longer the same person who had climbed the canyon wall an hour earlier. Catherine Running Wolf had discovered something about herself that no amount of education or cultural training could have taught her. When everything she valued was threatened, she would fight with every skill and strength her heritage had given her. Catherine. Dr. Mitchell was climbing down from his position, medical bag in hand and concern written across his face. "Are you hurt?" She looked down at herself, surprised to find splashes of blood on her clothes that belonged to other people. I'm all right." "You saved them," Lieutenant Harrison said, approaching with obvious respect. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen." Catherine looked toward the Morrison family, who were emerging from their shelter with tears of relief and gratitude. Tom Morrison was battered but alive. Sarah was holding her children protectively. And all four of them were looking at Catherine as if she had performed a miracle. But the person Catherine found herself thinking about was Elena Vasquez, back in Cedar Ridge, waiting to see whether the mixed-blood teacher would return or disappear. Like so many other people who had tried to bridge two worlds, we should get the wounded back to town, Catherine said practically. There will be questions to answer and reports to file. What she didn't say was that the hardest questions would be the ones she asked herself. She had killed 2 men today, saved 4 lives, and proven her loyalty beyond any reasonable doubt. But she had also discovered that survival sometimes required becoming someone you never thought you could be. As the rescue party prepared for the journey back to Cedar Ridge, carrying the Morrison family to safety and the surviving deserters to justice, Catherine Running Wolf wondered whether the community that had grudgingly accepted her as a teacher would know what to do with her as a warrior. The answer to that question would determine not just her own future, but the kind of place Cedar Ridge would become for all the mixed-blood children who needed to see that they could belong somewhere in America's rapidly changing world. The sun was setting over Cedar Ridge when the rescue party finally returned, their silhouettes dark against the orange sky. Word of their approach had spread quickly through the settlement, and it seemed like every resident had gathered along Main Street to witness their homecoming. But this wasn't the triumphant celebration Catherine had expected. The faces in the crowd showed confusion, uncertainty, and in some cases, barely concealed fear. Catherine rode beside the wagon carrying the Morrison family, her borrowed rifle across her saddle and dried blood still staining her clothes. She could feel the weight of dozens of stares, could hear the whispered conversations that followed their progress through town. The woman who had left that morning as a schoolteacher, suspected of divided loyalties, was returning as something the community didn't know how to classify. "Miss Catherine," little Amy Morrison called from the wagon, her small voice cutting through the crowd's murmur. "Are you going to keep teaching us?" The innocent question struck Catherine like a physical blow. In the heat of battle, in the desperate fight to save lives, she hadn't considered what her actions would mean for her carefully rebuilt life. She had killed 2 men today, efficiently, deliberately, without hesitation. Could someone who had done such things return to teaching arithmetic and reading to children? Dr. Mitchell rode closer, reading the doubt in her expression. "Catherine, what you did today was necessary, heroic. No one could fault you for, couldn't they?" Catherine interrupted quietly, nodding toward the crowd. "Look at their faces, James. They're not seeing a hero. They're seeing exactly what they always feared I might be, a savage who solved problems with violence." Margaret Fuller stood prominently among the gathered townspeople, her expression a mixture of vindication and revulsion. Beside her, Marcus Webb watched Catherine with the satisfaction of someone whose worst predictions had come true. Even among those who had supported her, Catherine could see uncomfortable recognition that their mild-mannered teacher had capabilities they hadn't imagined. Sheriff Hawkins emerged from the crowd to take custody of the 2 surviving deserters, both wounded but alive. "Miss Catherine," he said formally, "I'll need a full statement about what happened in that canyon." "Of course, Sheriff. And I want it on record," Hawkins continued, his voice carrying clearly across the street, "that without your courage and expertise, the Morrison family would be dead right now. You're a hero, and anyone who says different can answer to me." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some approving, others uncertain. Catherine appreciated the sheriff's support, but she could see it wouldn't be enough to overcome the fundamental Fear that her actions had awakened Dot as the crowd began to disperse. Elena Vasquez broke free from Ruth Mitchell's protective grip and ran toward Catherine's horse. The girl's face showed relief, pride, and something else, a desperate need for reassurance that her mentor hadn't been changed by violence into someone unreachable. "Miss Catherine," Elena called out, "you came back." Catherine dismounted and knelt to embrace the girl, feeling Elena's small arms wrap around her with fierce loyalty. In that moment, holding a child who understood what it meant to be caught between worlds, Catherine found her answer to Amy Morrison's question. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice meant for Elena but carrying to the listening crowd. "I came back. And tomorrow morning, I'll be in the schoolhouse teaching anyone who wants to learn." Elena pulled back to look at Catherine's face. "Some people are saying you killed those men." "Yes," Catherine replied honestly. "I did. To save the Morrison family. To save innocent people who couldn't save themselves." Elena nodded with the solemn understanding of a child who had seen enough of the world's harshness to grasp such complexities. "My father says sometimes good people have to do hard things to protect others. Your father is a wise man." Ruth Mitchell approached, her expression mixing relief with concern. "Catherine, are you all right? Really all right?" Catherine stood, keeping one hand on Elena's shoulder. "I'm different than I was this morning. I've learned things about myself that I didn't know before. But I'm still the same person who wants to teach children and help them understand that they can be anything they choose to be." Dr. Mitchell had been listening to this exchange while tending to Tom Morrison's injuries. Now he stepped forward with the moral authority his medical service had earned him. "Folks," he called out to the remaining crowd, "I think we need to be very clear about something. Miss Catherine didn't go looking for violence today. She didn't choose to become a killer. She chose to save lives, and she used whatever skills were necessary to do that. If we can't tell the difference between a murderer and a protector, then we're not the community I thought we were." Margaret Fuller stepped forward, her face tight with disapproval. "Dr. Mitchell, with all due respect," Miss Catherine revealed, "a capacity for violence that raises serious questions about her fitness to teach our children. What it reveals," said an unexpected voice, "is that she's willing to risk everything to protect people who needed protection." Everyone turned to see Tom Morrison approaching, leaning heavily on his wife's arm, but determined to have his say. His face was swollen and bruised, but his voice carried clear conviction. "That woman saved my family's lives," he continued. "She climbed a 100-foot cliff, killed 2 armed men, and put herself between my children and people who meant to murder them. If Cedar Ridge can't find room for someone like that, then Cedar Ridge doesn't deserve her." Sarah Morrison nodded firmly. "Our children would be dead without Miss Catherine. Dead. If anyone has a problem with her methods, they can explain to me why my baby should have died to preserve their delicate sensibilities." The direct challenge from the Morrison family carried weight that no amount of political maneuvering could overcome. These were people whose lives had literally been saved, and their testimony carried moral authority that even Margaret Fuller couldn't dismiss. Marcus Webb made one last attempt to voice opposition. "But the precedent," interrupted Lieutenant Harrison, who had been quietly observing the community dynamics, "is that Miss Catherine showed courage, skill, and loyalty when it mattered most. The Army is recommending her for a civilian commendation. If the military can recognize her service, I'd hope civilians could do the same." Catherine felt the mood of the crowd shifting, not to unanimous approval, but to grudging acceptance that her actions had been necessary and heroic rather than savage and threatening. It wasn't complete vindication, but it was enough to rebuild upon Dot as the gathering finally dispersed and normal evening routines resumed. Catherine found herself walking toward the schoolhouse with Elena, Ruth, and Dr. Mitchell. The building looked exactly the same as when she'd left that morning, but Catherine felt like she was seeing it through new eyes. Will you really be back tomorrow? Elena asked. If the school board doesn't object, Catherine replied. They won't, Ruth said firmly. At least not if they want to keep their teacher. Because if they force you out, I go too. Dr. Mitchell nodded agreement. And they'll have to find a new town doctor as well. Catherine felt tears threaten, not from fear or sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude for these people who had chosen to stand with her when standing with her carried social and professional risks. Thank you, she said simply, all of you. As they reached the schoolhouse, Catherine paused to look back at the town that had become her home. Cedar Ridge wasn't perfect. It still harbored prejudice and fear, still struggled with questions of belonging and acceptance. But it was also a place where a mixed-blood woman could teach children, where courage could overcome suspicion, where people could grow beyond their initial limitations. 6 months ago, Catherine Running-Wolf had arrived in Cedar Ridge as Victoria Wells, a desperate woman fleeing poverty and prejudice with nothing but carefully constructed lies to protect her. Tonight, she stood on the schoolhouse steps as herself, complete with all the complexities, contradictions, and capabilities that heritage implied. She had learned that home wasn't a place where you could hide your true nature, but a place where your true nature could find acceptance and purpose. She had discovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act righteously despite fear. Most importantly, she had proven to herself as much as to others that the choice between heritage and belonging was a false one. She could honor her Comanche father's warrior spirit and her white mother's gentle heart. She could teach Elena Vasquez to be proud of her mixed blood while helping other children understand that differences enriched rather than threatened communities. Elena tugged at Catherine's sleeve. Miss Catherine, tomorrow can you tell us about tracking? About how you knew those signs were fake? Catherine smiled, realizing that even her violent actions could become teaching tools for children who needed to understand how careful observation and cultural knowledge could serve justice. Tomorrow, she agreed, we'll talk about many things. About reading sign and reading people. About the difference between justice and revenge. About how sometimes the most important lessons come from the hardest experiences. As the first stars appeared over Cedar Ridge, Catherine Running-Wolf, teacher, warrior, bridge between worlds, prepared to face whatever challenges the future might bring. She had found her place at last, not by hiding who she was, but by becoming fully herself. Behind her, the schoolhouse waited for tomorrow's lessons. Before her stretched a life of purpose, acceptance, and the daily miracle of helping children discover their own strength and potential. The mail-order bride who had thought she knew her intended husband's secret had discovered something far more valuable: her own truth, and a community brave enough to embrace it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.